This is shop-bought bread. Easy, available, and cheap. Every loaf is identical. This one has a ton of ingredients, several of which I can't pronounce and don't really know what they are. This is a loaf of homemade sourdough bread. Slow to create, challenging at times, but simple. This has just 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. No 2 loaves are ever the same. You might think that I'm here to convince you to stop buying your bread and make it all instead, but I'm really not. I still sometimes buy the packaged sliced stuff myself. But when I started to make more of our bread at home, I would never have expected the changes that something as simple as a jar of sourdough starter would have on my life. This is about so much more than bread. You could say this is a way of life. What do you see when you look at this jar? I see possibility. With a jar of sourdough starter, regardless of whether or not it's been recently fed, I see a whole host of things that I can create to nourish myself and my family. I also see the miracle of life, because it kind of is miraculous, isn't it? That by mixing flour and water together and letting it just attract and be populated by wild yeasts, they develop this little colony in here, a community, if you will, inside of this jar. And that little colony will break down grains, making them more digestible, more nutritionally available, and more importantly, more delicious in the process. A dollop of this stuff and a few simple other ingredients can be brought together to create something as life-giving as a loaf of bread. Something that can be shared, something that can be savoured together. I find so much beauty in that simplicity, and it's kind of magical, right? So how has something as humble as a jar of sourdough starter changed my life? Kind of a bold claim, don't you think? But it has. It's changed my life in 5 quite possibly surprising ways, and I think in particular you're gonna like the connection between sourdough and rebellion. The first and possibly most obvious one: slowing down. There's a reason slow living and sourdough seem to go hand in hand. The sourdough will not be rushed. It will not be hurried. It isn't a shortcut. And I love it all the more for that. In her book, We Are What We Eat, Alice Waters says, "How we eat is how we live." And I think this actually can be extended to how we cook and create food, not just how we consume it. We've become so used to food being quick and easy, but in that convenience, we've lost depth and passion and an enjoyment of the process. Never mind the nutrition that we lose when food has been created for us to have access to and consume at speed and at all times. Sourdough, on the other hand, is like the antithesis of fast food culture. To start a loaf of bread, I must have forethought. I need to set the intention to create the loaf hours, if not days, before I actually want to sit down and eat it. The process takes time. Feeding the starter, waiting for it to do its thing, bringing the ingredients together, stretching and folding the dough lovingly over the course of maybe an hour or maybe sometimes 3. Waiting for that first rise, which could be overnight even, shaping the dough, creating tension in it, allowing it to rest and rise again, and baking, which isn't even the final step, because if you want to enjoy a fresh loaf of bread, you have to practice restraint and allow it to cool sufficiently so you don't ruin it by cutting into it too soon, which I've heard of happening, but of course I've never done myself. This is a slow process. It requires a certain presence of mind, lest you forget about your dough and let it over ferment or fail to stretch and fold it. And I love sourdough for that. I felt like I had already been living a slower than average pace of life, but when I really got into a rhythm and routine with my sourdough baking, it forced me to slow down and be present even more. It forced me to match my rhythm to its slower pace. Well, it didn't force me. I embraced that. I feel like we've come to value convenience and speed over all else. And I've talked about this in previous videos in reference to our cottage renovation. If you're new around here, we'll be renovating a 1880s stone cottage in the Irish countryside. And we're taking a slow approach to that. But as a society, we've become so used to celebrating the result and the outcome that I think often we've accidentally devalued and forgotten how to love the process. So that's what sourdough taught me about slowing down. The second thing that sourdough can teach us is how to simplify. As I fell more and more in love with sourdough baking, I was just so enamored with the simplicity of it. Flour, water, and salt, just 3 ingredients. And that simplicity made me turn an even more keen eye to what else had become overly complicated in the food we were consuming as a family. I mean, if you just turn over any package of shop-bought bread, which I do sometimes still buy, I'm not a purist, and also my daughter, rather annoyingly, likes a mass-produced wholemeal sandwich loaf from time to time. But if you turn it over and just look at the ingredients, there's all kinds of crap there. So it made me question more and more ingredients in things that we've been bringing into our home. So I'd been doing my best to shop organically for years and have cooked our meals from scratch the vast majority of the time. But there were still so many things that we were buying which I started to question and then to simplify. Things like tortilla wraps, crackers, crumpets. It's far more work to create these things at home, far less convenient, but it's simpler and it's more delicious, and there are fewer of the who knows what that's doing to me ingredients. So in this way, sourdough kicked off a desire to simplify a new area of my life in new ways. And now I use my sourdough starter in all kinds of things that I make with simple ingredients from scratch. Like this quiche that I made with sourdough pastry, or these hand pies, or homemade sourdough pasta, crepes, wraps, flatbreads, bagels, sourdough cookies. I could go on. I'm getting kind of hungry listening to these. The next, possibly surprising lesson of sourdough that's really made an impact on my life has been embracing failure. It's interesting because I've never actually been a perfectionist in the kitchen, and I say that's interesting because perfectionism has been a trait of mine in the past. It held me back in several other areas of life earlier in adulthood, and in running my own business, I finally had to learn how to start letting that go. So I've always thought home cooking should be perfectly imperfect. Let's leave all the fanciness and fastidiousness to the Michelin star chefs and enjoy that while we're there. Sourdough, however, made me embrace failure. And I think we could all do with making peace with failure, couldn't we? With allowing ourselves to get things wrong, make mistakes, and, well, just suck at something. Being faced with a failure, letting go of anything negative that fear wants to tell us about what this failure means about us as a person, because isn't that just what our brains love to do sometimes? Failing at something and being okay, that's the only way we can learn the lesson that exists in the failure. When we're too busy admonishing ourselves or throwing our hands up in the air with a "fine, I won't bother next time," we lose the opportunity to find a gift in that moment. Because when something hasn't turned out as expected, it's been my experience that there is always a gift and lesson in that. So we tried and failed to buy 3 properties before finally stumbling across this slice of heaven we're so fortunate to call home. Each failed purchase taught us something about what we really wanted. It helped to really focus our desires and what this dream really meant to us. It also taught us resilience, to hold on to the dream even in the face of failure. And ultimately, every failure led us a step closer to this place, this forever home of ours. And in my business, I've tried and failed things more times than I can count, and I'm a better coach and a better business owner for it. So with each failed loaf of sourdough, I've learned something about the process that makes me a better baker. And so sourdough has actually helped me to embrace failure, and in embracing failure, I'm actually now more likely to experiment, to take risks, because I'm less fearful of getting it wrong. So, side story relating to failure. Caravan and I, that's my husband, we didn't want to be parted from our regular sourdough loaves that we'd become accustomed to when we went travelling full time. So we took ourselves as a family off for 6 months of adventure around Europe in our camper van. The challenge, though, in advance was that the tiny oven in our van wouldn't fit my Dutch oven, my enamelled casserole dish, which is essential if you want to get a good rise and a good crust on that artisan style loaf. So we devised a plan to cook our loaves on our tiny travel gas barbecue. We even bought a rectangular cast iron Dutch oven for the occasion at significant cost. And in our last weeks in the UK, leading up to our departure, we set about experimenting this new setup, and we burnt many, many loaves along the way. Yep, nicely burnt on both sides now. But we finally figured out how to create a passable, although far from perfect, loaf in our barbecue. But as it transpired, I was at first preoccupied with eating all of the bread and other baked delights made by the many artisans that we encountered on our travels, and so I just entirely failed to find a way to match up the haphazard rhythms of van life and full-time travel with sourdough baking, and so my starter died. Another fail, and that's okay. The fourth life lesson, or maybe life skill, or a definite change that's been helping me in life that has come about as a result of getting into sourdough baking is delayed gratification. So in this time of instant dopamine hit technology and same day delivery, I feel like we're losing our ability to take pleasure in the unfolding of things, the anticipation, the waiting. We want everything, and we want it now. Now. Waiting feels annoying and like a waste of time, doesn't it? And so much is available to us instantly that we rarely have to wait these days. But are we happier for it? Something I've loved about sourdough is that it is an exercise in delayed gratification. The hit is not instant. Yes, there is pleasure in the eating, so much. But the anticipation of that is also a delight. I think it's good for us to turn our hands to things that make us wait. When we're made to wait, then we give ourselves the opportunity to find joy in both the waiting and also in the process. And there's something deeply therapeutic for me about baking. So the fifth and possibly the most surprising of these life changes is that sourdough baking has encouraged me to break the rules. Not that I need a ton of encouragement. There could be this idea that sourdough baking, especially if you want to make that kind of artisan style loaf, needs to be this technical, scientific, rule-driven affair. And in fact, that assumption put me off trying sourdough for a really long while. But fortunately, I found a lady named Lisa Bass. She has a YouTube channel and blog called Farmhouse on Boone. God bless this woman and her more relaxed approach to sourdough baking, because I felt I'd found a kindred spirit as a mentor, albeit someone who just mentors me via her YouTube content. You see, I was a bit of a rebellious teenager. There's still a rule breaker part of me that kind of won't quit, and it makes me constantly question why. Why must we do it that way though? What happens if we don't? And I guess that's kind of how I've ended up here, having opted out of several of the rules and systems that feel chosen for us. Attempting to grow our own food, going off grid, making my own money instead of working for somebody else, opting out of hustle culture. So now that I understand which rules of sourdough can be broken, I take all the more pleasure in it. But I really think that sourdough can provide us with that opportunity to question, but why? Why must I discard some of my sourdough starter? What happens if I don't, for example? And I think we really need to be questioning more in our life in these times, because otherwise we just end up unconsciously following a path that's been laid out for us, but isn't one that we necessarily chose for ourselves. So if sourdough gets to be the gateway into that questioning, that light rebellion, or just another joyful opportunity to tear up the rulebook, then so much the better. So here's to sourdough baking. A simple, slower rhythm we can adopt to nourish ourselves, nourish our friends and family, and in the process, possibly change our lives for the better.
Rice bread is so good.
Until next time, my love, tear up the rulebook, embrace slowness, maybe make a loaf of bread. Go live your dream life. Bye for now.